The Canon R8 is now available for less than $1,300. That's a full-frame camera with the same sensor as the Canon R6 Mark II with oversampled 4K 60 and a body that feels way better in the hand than it has any right to at this point. But this camera is already about 3 years old now, so is it still worth getting in 2026? That's why in this video I mainly want to test the stabilization of this camera, but also compare it to some competitors in terms of dynamic range. And most importantly, I recently brought it to Krachan National Park here in Thailand, where I tested it for vlogging and filming myself. So there we can see how it performs under real-world shooting conditions. So I would say let's have a look at that first. Testing, testing. So let me put up. Okay, here, left. Dusky leaf monkeys. It's the first time that I use that. I have no idea how to put that together. I think using such a tent would have never been possible when I was younger, because you would certainly not wake up in this position. So goal number 1 is achieved. I found a sun bear and he was so cool, like such a cute one, like actually much smaller than I expected. It was funny, I'm not sure if that photo turned out good, but he was like behind the oven, tried to hide from me, I think. And then he was looking around and that looked so cool. I hope that photo looks good. Yeah. Of my light, you see the 2 eyes, it's reflections. I never thought I would ever say that in Thailand, but I'm so cold. I was freezing all night, sitting here now in my car just to heat up. So I think you can already see from the vlog that the Canon R8 is actually a pretty capable camera. There hasn't been a time while I shot this vlog where I felt limited by it. Even the dynamic range in the car looks actually good, but of course I had a little advantage there because I use ceramic shield, what blocks a bit of light, but still the footage looks great and there's some detail left in the shadows. Anyway, the biggest downside of this camera is definitely the missing ibis, but it can also be seen as an advantage because you don't get the typical Canon wobble that you always see on cameras such as the R5 Mark II that have sensor stabilization, which many of you have been complaining about in the comments in my recent video about why I switched to Canon. So the R8 kind of solves this issue, but of course comes with the downside that the stabilization on some lenses might not be good enough, and that's why I would say let's have a look at how problematic it actually is. So let's test the stabilization of this camera. This is probably what you would do the most right now. Like, I only use optical image stabilization on the 15-35 f2.8 currently. And so there's no IBIS, there's no digital image stabilization, nothing. So how does it look? Let me know in the comments. Like, we of course don't see any corner wobbles, but of course there might be a little bit of shake in there or some jitters. Well, it's not walking super fast or careful. I'm walking as if I would walk when I run a normal vlog. And now we're essentially doing the exact same test again, just with digital image stabilization on, what means that we're getting a small crop there. You can definitely notice that it's a bit closer, but therefore it should also be a bit more stable. So let me know what you think of that, if you prefer that cropped in but a bit more stable over the first one, or if you prefer the first one with a bit wider angle. Must also say it's 15 millimeters, so it is probably not that bad to crop in here. On the 16 millimeter, if we like put the camera to around 16 millimeter, what it should be now, this is how it would look like if you would use the 16 to 28 millimeter lens. And let's also give it a quick test with enhanced digital image stabilization, which I think already crops a bit too much, but it is still usable, at least when I'm at 15 millimeters here. And that should be super stable. So I think there you won't really have any issues anymore, because optical image stabilization from that lens already takes out all the micro jitters, and then plus all the digital image stabilization should get overall a really nice image. And by the way, on all those tests here, I'm at shutter 1/50 using an ND filter. So if there are any motion artifacts, that should also be visible. But what I'm actually more excited about now is to test how it actually performs for B-roll, and especially when I use a lens that is not stabilized at all. Now, before we come to the B-roll, there is also one more thing that I want to emphasize here, and that is that you don't always have to walk when you vlog. Like now, I'm at 15 millimeters here. I have only the normal OIS from that lens on, no digital image stabilization, and it should look perfectly fine. Like, you don't always have to walk when you vlog. Just stand still for a moment, it's fine. I think we really only have to walk when we vlog, when there's actually something going on around us, and we want to show that, we want to emphasize that in our videos. So maybe if you really have problems with stabilization in your camera, just stand still. Marcus, what do you think? Should people stand when they vlog or walk?
Yeah, I mean walk up.
Oh,
That's not good.
man.
Okay. I mean walk, of course, is way more exciting, or?
It depends. Like, it can be more exciting when you walk, because then something is going on.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're also not really focused on the content then. Like, I think
That's
it depends
true.
on the situation.
Yeah, it depends, I think, right? If you have something exciting going on, I think.
Yeah, if you're like really in action or so. But yeah, if you really want to talk about a certain topic, if it gets deep, then I would stand still. But yeah, you're right. When it comes to a travel vlog, yeah, then yeah, maybe showing a bit while you're doing something, it can make sense. But not necessarily always walking, like also while you're doing something with your hands.
Yeah, that's true. You can just stand and show something, or
Okay, thanks for your insight. When it comes to testing the stabilization for B-roll, I do think that if you just have a stabilized lens, that is already enough, even without digital image stabilization. There is a little bit of shake in there, yes, but it feels quite natural, and you can also easily fix it in the edit by adding a little bit of post-stabilization. If you want to add digital image stabilization in camera, I do think this works better for static shots, because when you move the camera, it looks like the stabilization fights your movement a bit, which can also be corrected in post by adding more stabilization, but that kind of defeats the purpose of using DIS in camera in the first place. I'm also not a big fan of enhanced stabilization, because it crops too much and it looks like it doesn't stabilize that much more. If you use non-stabilized lenses, you definitely have to turn digital image stabilization on, and the footage is overall usable, but if you look closely, you can see a tiny bit of motion artifacts. It's not very prominent, so I think on social media you can get away with it, but that's definitely not footage that you would sell as stock footage or so. So it's definitely best to use a tripod or gimbal, or at least rest your arms somewhere while you're getting such shots. And I would also not recommend using enhanced stabilization, because it doesn't do much more, but it emphasizes the motion blur effects a lot. I also tested it with my 70-200mm f2.8 lens at 200 millimeters, and my findings were quite similar. Like, I had optical image stabilization on here, but there were still still some motion artifacts when I used digital image stabilization, and enhanced DIS also made it worse. However, if you hold your hands still, I do find only using optical image stabilization at 200mm quite usable actually. What you can also do for such shots is to simply raise the shutter speed, at least if you don't have much motion in there, because with a high shutter speed you don't get those motion blur artifacts and the footage actually turns out pretty good, and you don't even have to crank it up that much, like 1/100 or 1/125 is oftentimes already enough. And by the way, I also got this shot here with the R8 and 35mm f1.4 lens, so no stabilization there aside from the normal digital image stabilization. I shot it in 4K 60 at shutter speed 1/125, and as you can see, it looks perfectly smooth. Of course, 4K 60 helps with it, but still, it almost looks like being shot on a robot, so if you just train your hands a bit, you can. So, the stabilization tests have been pretty much what I expected, but a bit more interesting was the dynamic range test. First, I have to say that the dynamic range of the R8 is actually not as bad in that test as I thought, but of course, you can see that there is less dynamic range on the R8 compared to the R5 Mark II and the Fujifilm X M5, which is even cheaper and an APS-C camera. That's quite interesting. Also, I would overall give it to the Fujifilm here, because while the dynamic range overall seems to be similar on the R5 Mark II, the noise actually looks a bit nicer and less pronounced on the Fuji compared to the Canon, at least in the original log file. But, well, we also know that Fuji does a great job with their X-Trans sensors, and by the way, you would get the same image on the Fujifilm X S20, because that's the same sensor and same f-log profile, etc. So the Canon R8 definitely loses against other cameras, even cheaper ones in terms of dynamic range, but under real-world shooting conditions you encounter those situations where you actually need that much dynamic range to get good shots not that often, and that's why it's actually not a super big issue. Like, even that vlogging shot from before, you see one time where the sun is straight behind me pretty small while my face is still perfectly visible, so most of the time the dynamic range of the Canon R8 is sufficient. Okay, so much about the stabilization and dynamic range. Another factor that was actually bad when I tested the R8 the last time 3 years ago was the lens situation, and Canon still did not open the mount for third-party full-frame lenses, so it's still not as good as on other systems, but the situation did change quite a bit because Canon released quite a few new lenses which are more affordable and also closed some gaps in the system, and these are mainly the 16-to-28mm and 28-to-70mm f2.8, the 45mm f1.2, which is surprisingly cheap at around $500 and gives you a ton of bokeh, and all the new f1.4 prime lenses, which are still above $1,000, so not precisely cheap, but also not crazy expensive, and they definitely close the gap that you either had to choose between lightweight f1.8 primes or heavy 1.2 primes. The only downside with the f1.4 primes and the 45mm is that they don't have optical image stabilization, so as we've seen in the tests, you will have to use digital image stabilization there or put the camera on a tripod or a gimbal. That isn't actually that bad, because usually when you're handheld, a zoom lens like the 28-to-70mm is fine, and those zoom lenses are stabilized, so they are perfectly usable for handheld use, and that's also how I essentially use the R8. Like, whenever I put my 35mm f1.4 on it, I have it on a tripod to film myself, and whenever it's in my hand, I just use it with a stabilized zoom lens. If you want to use prime lenses handheld though, you do have the 35mm f1.8 and 85mm f2 available, which both offer optical image stabilization, and they are also quite lightweight and affordable, so they definitely pair well with the R8. So lenses on Canon are certainly not perfect, but you do have plenty of options available now at different price points. Okay, now when it comes to my personal thoughts about the Canon R8 in 2026 based on the past 5 months, I can only say that at first that it's kind of my favorite camera body, because it's quite slim and has a pretty deep grip, which, like all Canon bodies, feels really nice in your hands. It could be a tiny bit thicker and feel a bit less plasticky, but considering that it keeps the weight so low, I'm fine with that. The battery life is also not as bad as you might think when it comes to the small batteries. Like, I usually bring 2 spare batteries with me, and so far I never had to change twice, and that is essentially the same as with all my other cameras. Usually when I'm on a trip, I didn't measure the battery life, but from actual shooting scenarios, it to me feels a bit lower than on my Sonys especially that I used before, but it is also not bad. Like, I would not worry about it at all, and because the batteries are so small and quite affordable, you can also just bring a few more. The biggest competitor cameras that I see are at first the Panasonic S5, which is actually cheaper than this one and also a great full frame camera. However, the autofocus seems to be worse on the S5 compared to the Canon R8, which is why I think for most people the R8 will certainly be the better camera, even if the dynamic range of the S5 might be a bit better and it has IBIS. The other one is the Panasonic S5 Mark II, which has decent autofocus, even if Canon performs a bit better, but it is between $400 and $700 more expensive depending on what deals you can get, and has a crop in 4K 60, so you really have to decide for yourself if that's worth it for you or not. Therefore, you also have more affordable lens choices available with the Panasonic system. And another question is, in my opinion, if you might not want to go APS-C in that price range and get the Fujifilm X-S20 or Sony a6700 or FX30, because these are cameras that are overall offer quite a few more features while also having impressive video quality, which in certain situations can actually be even better than the Canon R8 despite the smaller sensor. But therefore, of course, if you want to upgrade to a full frame camera in the future, you might have to purchase different lenses or switch systems completely, especially when you shoot Fujifilm. That's why overall I think it's definitely not wrong to go with the Canon R8 in the first place. And that leads me to the conclusion of the Canon R8 in 2026. It's definitely not a perfect camera, but I think it's totally worth getting considering the price. The only thing that I would worry a bit about currently, like in January 2026, is that Canon might release an R8 Mark II in the next few months, which, if they do that, hopefully has the same sensor as the Canon R6 Mark III, which we all know is impressive and offers even more features. But when that happens, I also assume that the camera will be quite a bit more expensive, probably around $1,700 or $1,800. And that's why I think that if you want to go budget, there's actually no reason not to buy the Canon R8 currently, so you're relatively safe. So much about the R8 specifically. If you want to know more about why I switched back to Canon from Sony, watch this video here in the corner. It's actually not what you might think. Like, the reasons I switched are more personal. And if you found this video helpful, you will find an affiliate link to the R8 in the description below. That gives me a small commission, but you don't pay anything extra. So this is the best way to support this channel. And of course, also consider subscribing for upcoming videos about Canon cameras and general filmmaking. And yeah, I'm out and hope to see you in the next video.